Edmund Ironside is one of the great lost kings in English history. Son of the hopeless Aethelred the Unready, Edmund, born at some point in the early 990s, grew up in a time when England was being torn asunder by the Viking wars that his father was losing badly. Throughout the early years of the new millennium, England became a disheartened place as the Danes ran riot, with medieval chroniclers bemoaning the pitiful defence of the country that was being put up by King Aethelred and his council. William of Malmesbury writes of Aethelred in rather acid fashion. He was as much of an object of contempt to his family as he was to strangers. Was Aethelred really an object of contempt for Edmund? Well, there's certainly evidence to suggest that Edmund was not impressed with his father's kingship. After Aethelred had been forced into exile in Normandy in the winter of 1013, Edmund's stepmother, Emma, and two of his half brothers, Alfred and Edward, had crossed the Channel before they were joined by Aethelred, who had been fearful of the reception he might receive in Normandy. Not joining them was Edmund, who remained in England. Why was this the case? Well, it's a safe bet that Edmund was seeking to distance himself, literally in this case, from the style of kingship that his father had employed. As a young prince, Edmund intended to stand and fight the Danes, whilst Aethelred's method of defeating the Danes had been a horrible mishmash of bribery, disorganized campaigns, massacres, and incompetence. What absolutely infuriated Edmund most of all was the fact that Athelred had, in his desperation to defeat the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, allied himself with another Viking, Thurkel the Tall. Thurkel's men, the year before Athelred's brief exile, had been responsible for the reprehensible murder of Alfheir, the Archbishop of Canterbury. To form an alliance with such a man was pretty shocking from Athelred, and Edmund was not impressed. In short, Athelred's actions were that of a coward, and Edmund wasn't having anything to do with it. In 1015, after Athelred had been restored to the throne, Edmund began to come into his own as a young prince. Following the shocking double murder of two thanes at the Council of Oxford by the vile Edric Striona, but with the full knowledge of Athelred, Edmund would now have to forge his own path if he wished to avoid being tarnished by his father's corrupt regime. The widow of one of the murdered thanes was kept a prisoner in Malmesbury, but Edmund would not only free her, but also, enamoured by her beauty, marry her as well, expressly against his father's wishes. This was clear evidence that Edmund was now very much his own man, and he knew full well that the wind was blowing firmly against his ailing father. Edmund's concern now was trying to ensure that he would succeed Athelred, but in order to do that, he would have to defeat Cnut, the son of Athelred's old adversary, Svein. But things were promising for the energetic Edmund. As he swept across the country, through the Midlands, and into the north, he would find loyalty was quickly forthcoming. The English could see the stark contrast between the dithering and indecisive old king and this dashing and brave young warrior. But Canute, about the same age as Edmund, and now well versed in the art of war, would be a fierce enemy for Edmund to overcome. There would also be another crucial and ultimately decisive factor in this war for the English crown, the unscrupulous Edric Striona. There is a very telling passage in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles where Edric went to Athelred, probably when the king's health was failing him, and coaxed him to hand over a fleet of some 40 ships. Having done this, Edric promptly submitted to Canute. This was a truly shocking act of betrayal that was a sign of things to come from Edric. By the spring of 1016, Edmund was with his dying father in London, and Athelred eventually died on the 23rd of April. Edmund was swiftly declared king by the English, but Canute was now sailing for London. these two young men were now ready for a monumental tug of war for the English crown. Over the coming months, Edmund would live up to every bit of his Ironside reputation. What a shame, then, that this great rivalry would be decided by that wretched ealdorman of Mercia, Edric Striona. On Aethelred's death, Edmund had rode out from London, where the people were loyal to him. He rode westwards into the heart of Wessex, where he found submission to his kingship was forthcoming. But in the meantime, Cnut and his fleet had sailed on London, but found that the city was stoutly defended. Frustrated in his designs of capturing the city, Cnut raised a siege and instead went in pursuit of Edmund, and the two sides joined in battle at Penselwood in Somerset. Edmund emerged triumphant, as Cnut's army was forced into flight. At Sherston, Edmund again engaged the Danes in battle, himself fighting right in the very heart of the mix, commanding and encouraging his men, whilst ferociously wielding his own sword and cutting down many of his enemies. According to Florence of Worcester, Edric Striona, fighting in Cnut's ranks at Sherston, cut off the head of a man who looked a little like the English king and showed it to Edmund's army, falsely declaring that Edmund Ironside had been killed in the battle. On this occasion, there would be no mass retreat, as there would be later at Ashenden. For 2 days, the fighting at Sherston was ferocious and bloody until Cnut eventually withdrew, preferring to turn back towards London instead, which he would once again lay siege to. However, Edmund would come to London's rescue, and not long after, a matter of days, Edmund defeated the Danes at Brentford. By this stage, Cnut and indeed Edric would have had a very good idea as to the immense capabilities of their foe. If they were to emerge victorious, Cnut and Edric would need to come up with a new plan. On the evidence they had so far, defeating Edmund outright in battle seemed most unlikely. Perhaps more underhanded means would be necessary, and Edric was certainly capable of stooping to such lengths. The ealdorman pretended to make peace with Edmund in order to betray him, as Henry of Huntingdon puts it. Edmund had Cnut on the run, and the Danes, in their desperation, were, in scenes reminiscent of days past, reduced to butchering and pillaging as they went. For Cnut, this was not a wise idea, as he was a man who intended to become king of the land that he was now laying waste to. Edmund pursued him with vigour and energy until he reached Aylesford, where Edmund was persuaded from continuing his pursuit by Edric Striona. It was claimed that Edmund was on the very brink of claiming a total victory over Cnut until Edric's intervention. Henry of Huntingdon says of this that worse advice had never been given in England. Edmund may have thought that Edric was his man, but in reality the ealdorman was acting as Cnut's inside man, and at Ashenden Edric would turn the war in Cnut's favour, a war up until that time he had been firmly losing. Again, Ashenden was going the way of Edmund, but in the midst of the battle, Edric made his move by persuading the English army that Edmund had fallen, leading the retreat from the battlefield. Edmund and the remainder of the English army were left in the lurch as Cnut took the victory. Numerous English nobles died in the battle in a crucial, although not quite decisive moment in English history. I say not quite decisive, as, after all, Edmund was still alive and prepared to fight on, but he was persuaded to make peace with Cnut, this time by not only Edric, but by other more loyal supporters as well. It is possible, indeed probable, that Edmund was feeling the effects of injuries sustained at Ashenden, and this led to him seeking an agreement with the Danes at this point in time. And so the fighting ceased, and for a short time England had two kings. But a matter of weeks after Ashenden, Edmund died. A later story goes that Edmund was murdered going to the toilet by Edric Striona, but a more likely version of events is that Edmund never recovered from his battle injuries. He would be laid to rest at Glastonbury Abbey, near to his grandfather Edgar the Peaceful. Edmund's story wasn't quite done yet, as he had two infant sons who would be forced to live a life of exile until the reign of Edmund's half-brother, Edward the Confessor. What a remarkable man Edmund Ironside was, an outstanding warrior who, disgusted by his father's incompetence and treachery to his people, began as a young prince to forge his own path, the path of a warrior and a hero for the English nation.